Hello. Archbishop Alexander Golitzin of Dallas, the South, and the Bulgarian Diocese taught patristics at Marquette University, Wisconsin from 1989 to 2012. Author of many works on the Christian ascetical and mystical tradition, he is a co-founder of the Theophania School, a project that aims to recover the theophanic language of the Eastern Christian tradition. Please welcome Archbishop Golitzin.
I'll be speaking from a few scribbled notes, so there might be some hesitations, and I wanted to make sure that I stay inside the half hour that I've been given. I could easily run over. I'm delighted to be here. I'm delighted to hear that you're founding an institute for the study of Eastern Christianity. I know you have some splendid people here at CU, including my old friend and colleague, Robin Young, and her, as I said to her earlier today, and her galaxy of former grad students who are, many of them, prominent and splendid theologians. And Sidney Griffith, whom I learned to love in our cooperation in the Orthodox Catholic Consultation of North America, and whose presence there I miss intensely every time I'm obliged to go. So thank you for those two, and thank you for having me. Some 40 years ago, I was sitting in a meeting room in the monastery of Simonos Petrus with the fathers of the monastery around their abbot, waiting for instruction. And the abbot began with a question. Why did you become monks? And then went on. Now, I hope it wasn't to wear dresses and ring bells. That's not adequate. You should have become a monk for one reason, and one reason only, and that is to see God. And I thought, wow. And I had more wows with respect to this particular abbot in subsequent months and years. At the end of that year, I was invited by the same abbot to spend a year at his monastery in hopes of finally getting started on writing my dissertation, which had languished, and I'll come to that in a moment. And I accepted gladly. You aren't invited every day to spend a year at an Athonite house by its abbot. And it was clearly something special, and as indeed it turned out to be. That year changed my life. I think for the better. The abbot was Emilianos. And he figures centrally in my remarks this morning, just as he figured centrally in my work. He was the key, in fact, via the monastery that he presided over and whose life he organized, and whose priorities he assigned. And he was also the key in his person. We'll come to that. He was personally the answer for me to the question of my talk's, the second part of my talk's title. Why monks? Well, exactly to produce a guy like this. and as well in his person to open the way toward a theology of the monk and the Visio Dei that he advocated to his monks. Hence, then, the psalm verse that I imperfectly represented in the first part of my talk's title, to see your form. But the verse itself, which comes from Psalm 17, verse 15, reads in a friend of mine's translation of the Hebrew, "As for me, I will stare at your face in righteousness. I will be sated with your form in awaking." That will take quite a bit of unpacking that we haven't fully time for, but I hope to touch on it a little. And then from the Greek, the Septuagint, "I will appear to your face in righteousness, and I will be fed in the appearance of your glory." There's some heady stuff there that I hope we can get to. And I find myself thus directed to the following questions. Who was this Emilianos? And that will entail a little bit of biographical reminiscence, which I hope you won't mind. And secondly, what is the role of the monk in the economy of the Church's life and history? And this in turn is linked to the question of Christian anthropology and of Christology itself. And finally, the last leads us to the revelation to Israel, especially the tradition of the theophanies of the so-called Old Testament. It's a locution I'm not altogether fond of, because it suggests there's some sort of gap between the two bodies of Scripture, and there isn't. There is a single revelation to Israel. And with respect to the theophanies, particularly the word for divine glory in Hebrew, kavod, in which my graduates all heard constantly, and even my unfortunate and long-suffering undergraduates were forced to learn, together with the word eschatological, which had to be repeated about 15 times in the course of the semester. And all of these questions, directions, are in a way summed up in the person of my abbot, my spiritual father, a saint, so I am convinced, as proof of the resurrection. Or as close, anyway, as we can come to proof in this world. Let me begin with a personal, with a reminiscence. In 1977, I was in a very bad way. I had taken on an absolutely intractable ancient father for my dissertation. That was Dionysius Areopagites, or as the Germans like to say, Pseudo-Dionysius. There's a wonderful line from Hans von Balthasar's chapter on Dionysius in his Herrlichkeit, which goes something like the following. The panzer divisions of German Wissenschaft have invaded the delicate garden of the Areopagite, and when they were finished, they left behind nothing except tread marks spelling out the single word pseudo. Well, I'll refer an occasion in a moment to those Panzer divisions, because they were my problem. That is, the picture, that pseudo, was what was leaving me at a loss. At a loss because I was perfectly willing to follow that consensus and write up Dionysius as a thoroughgoing villain and fraud, except I was faced with two problems. Number one, if you look at the reception of the Areopagitica in the ancient Christian world, everybody from the imperial church in Constantinople to the so-called Monophysites, they aren't, Miaphysites, to the so-called Monophysites in Alexandria and Syria and Palestine, to the so-called Nestorians, they sort of aren't, in Persia. They all thought he was the cat's pajamas. And that wasn't just because of the apostolic pseudonym. They really thought he was good and important. So that raised the question, how could these guys have been fooled by an obvious fraud? A blatant anachronism. Does that mean they were all wrong? And if they were all wrong, what's that say about the church, about the faith, about the tradition where he's still enshrined? So it led to what the French call a crise de foi, which can be either liver problems or, as in my case, a question of faith. And that was what had led me to that room on Mount Athos. I had made up my mind, I've got to find out if this is all true before I can do anything else. And how do I find out it's true? I have to find a holy man, someone who embodies this. And where am I going to find one of those? If they exist, surely they're scattered all over the world. But where is the most, how to say, reliable concentration of holy man in the Orthodox world? What had been providing the Orthodox world with holy men for 1,000 years? Well, that was obviously Mount Athos. And Athos was not under the communist yoke like all the other countries in the Orthodox world, except Greece. So I'll go there. It meant wangling a scholarship from the Church of Greece, whereby I was assisted by Athenagoras of Thyatira of blessed memory, of whom I maintain very fond memories. And so I went, and the first thing I did was make a beeline to Mount Athos, where I went to Simonos Petros, because I'd heard of their abbot. I'd run across this dapper young Athenian in England at ecumenical dues, and he was absolutely charming. And then I encountered him, when I first got to Oxford, I met him. And then I met him 2 years later, and he had become, from this charming, sharply dressed young fellow, he had become this hairy apparition. Skirts, beard, hair, the lot. And I said, "What happened to you?" And he said, "I met a holy man." "Who's that?" "The abbot of Great Meteora in Meteora." "Who's he?" "His name is Emilianos." "Okay." So so I filed it away in the back brain for future reference. And thus ended up visiting his monastery my first month in Greece. And I saw him and was not impressed. It's this podgy little Greek holding out his hand to be kissed by the monks after trapeza. And I thought to myself, being of the Vietnam generation, with an almost pathological distrust of authority, and I thought, I've been sitting in episcopal offices now several times in this country, decorated with a pompous combination of pretense and Byzantine kitsch. And I recognize this type. I don't want any more Mediterranean paterfamiliae. But the monastery was a little different. First of all, the services. Now, my background is Russian, at least my father's side. And a thing about Russian Orthodoxy is that it insists on beauty, maybe even too much, but Father Milinos told me once, they're awfully heavy, those services. Vari. And services on Mount Athos were not an aesthetic treat in the late 70s. They were hours and hours and hours and hours of forever. They were an ascetic feat, if you want to sit through, but not much by way of edification, certainly not aesthetic pleasure. This monastery was absolutely different. The services were gorgeous, elegant, brisk, crisp. The Byzantine chant sung by two choirs banging forth at each other over the course of the service. A thrill. The young monks were pleasant, slender, and sane. So I thought, there's something right going on here. I don't know about that guy, but I'll come back. I'll come back and see. And I did. And over the course of that first year, I began to see through my initial impression of the abbot, watching him deal with his monks, hearing him talk. I couldn't understand much. It took me a while to get the spoken Greek. But there was something about him, too, that I had missed in that initial impression. So I went to him at the end of that year when I had a decision to make, whether to continue with the apparently futile dissertation or to take up an offer by the old bishop who had ordained my father deacon when my father was dying of cancer. The bishop's solution was not an unction service. It said, let's ordain him. And it was a good move. My father died very happy as a deacon. And he said, you've done this academic stuff long enough. I mean, what did it profited you? Come back. Come be my kelenik, my cell attendant, and I'll make you my deacon and you'll travel with me. And I was really tempted. I thought, well, I should get a blessing. So I went to the monastery, trusting that Father Milinos would say, oh, yes, my child, go. And he didn't. Instead, he said, child, if you don't finish that work, you're going to be haunted by it the rest of your life, and you'll never finish it if you take this offer. So tell you what. You write your old bishop and you say, wait a bit, Vladika. I have a little bit more work to do. And you come here to my monastery. You want a typewriter? Ask. We'll give you a typewriter. You want paper? Ask. We'll give you paper. You want trousers? Ask. He'll give you trousers. Whatever you want, ask, and we'll give it to you. You just work on that. That'll be your obedience. And so it turned out. I started to write. It just came to me as I wrote. And it came to me because of that abbot and that monastery. Now, Dionysius is clearly a student of the late Neoplatonists, and particularly Proclus Diadochus, whom he quotes, whose teaching on evil he paraphrases, and in fact sometimes lifts whole phrases, in chapter 4 of Divine Names. And a key to Neoplatonism is the dyad prodos epistrophe, procession and return. As it were, expansion and dilation and contraction, referring to first to the outpouring of God into the world and then the return of the world to God. Procession and return. And I thought, what does that mean? Okay, this is, it's a basic plan for the Summa Theologia of Aquinas. God going out, creature coming back. So, okay, so fine. Does it have any application to the inner life, to the life of the Christian? Well, beyond the obvious creation and return to God. And I found it. That monastery was so constructed and emphases so placed that the monks vigil in his cell, and this abbot insisted on vigils. He wanted them staying up at night, doing the Jesus prayer, reading the Psalter, or heck, reading any good book. They had blessings to do novels, yes? Good novels, one trusts, but novels. Something serious. But to stay up with God, that was the emphasis. To stay up with attendance, to be alone with God alone, yes? And following the nightly vigil, there were the services. In particular, Holy Communion. They wanted to do it every day, but this was a group that had moved into an old monastery that was dying from Great Meteora. And as was the custom, or is the custom, a new group comes, its leader becomes the new abbot. But they had already made some changes that had the old men riled. Part of that interminable and deathly quality of the services in the other Athonite monasteries that I mentioned was the fact that, kind of piety over the centuries had larded things into the services. Oh, we'll do a parochlesis at this point, and we'll have a special devotion to so-and-so at that point. And the service is kind of stretched and stretched, stretched and stretched. Stretched some more. First thing that Emilianos did when he came in was say, okay, everyone, services by the book and what's in the book only. No additions. And the old guys were kind of, And then all these young men were going to communion all the time when the custom was once a month. Finally, one can't stand it any longer, pokes one of the young men and says, what do you think that is, soup? So So they realized they couldn't have communion every day without creating a revolt. So they didn't. It was usually 4 days a week. Compromise. But the point of the organization of the monastery was that, as it were, their nightly vigil was to be understood as culminating in that vision of God which is the divine liturgy. Vision and communion with God, that is the divine liturgy and communion. First sense, if you will, of the Visio Dei, the liturgy. Like one of my students' wives, he was courting her, I think in Berkeley. She's now, by the way, a distinguished Old Testament scholar. And he says, well, how do I get her to be Orthodox? She was some variant of Protestant. Oh, I'll take her to church first. Let her see it and get used to it. So he takes her back to a local church. She walks in and looks around. Thinks a minute. And then says, oh, yes, apocalypse. And she got it in one. I mean, it's just exactly what it is. And it's supposed to be. And so it was intended by Father Emilianos, that this be an apocalypse, the revelation. Answering to the movement into the heart in the nightly vigil. And that further clued me in. This is all happening sort of subconsciously, because it kind of came out as I wrote. That further clued me into the second problem with the Dionysian corpus, the reason I couldn't make it work. And that was the apparent flat contradiction between, on the one hand, the famous little treatise Mystical Theology, which has starts with Moses ascending Sinai into the darkness of the cloud and of the cloud of unknowing, which clearly speaks of a direct encounter with God. And on the other hand, the treatises of the hierarchies, where you have the apparent exact opposite. Everything is mediated. The firsts teach the seconds, teach the thirds. The seraphim and cherubim teach the thrones, dominions, and principalities, and they teach the archangels and angels, and they teach the bishops, and they teach the priests, and they teach the deacons, and they teach the layfolk. So where's direct experience here? And it was a solution to that contradiction because ultimately, and here one has to add, in the Corpus Areopagiticum, I am firmly convinced that what is meant by the word hierarchy, which he invented, that's his coinage so far as we can tell. The proper meaning, understanding of hierarchy is liturgy, structured worship. And the structured worship of the church, which is divinely given, he mentions that, as well as its source, not simply in our Lord and the Last Supper, but the revelation to Moses and Sinai, starting in Exodus 25. By the way, if any of you have read through the Bible straight or tried to, as I did when I was a first-year undergraduate, you really do swimmingly through Genesis and the first part of Exodus, all kinds of great stories, adventures, and then you hit a wall. You get pages and pages and pages on kinds of wood and colors of yarn and lots of cupids. And the curious thing is, though, if you look at the ancient church fathers, as well as their contemporary in the rabbinic circles, their contemporaries in the rabbinic circles. None of these people can get enough of those same stunningly stupefying chapters. None of them. Gregory Nyssa writes the life of Moses, and he spends about half his book on those very chapters. Why? Because it's a revelation of true worship. This is how God is to be worshipped. And it is a revelation of true worship because, as God says, you will make it according to the pattern that I show you. Exactly. Well, what's the pattern that God shows Moses? In Greek, the word is even stronger that renders the Hebrew tabnit. It's paradigm, paradigma. That's maybe echoes of the Platonic forms for a contemporary Greek then, or an educated one anyway. What did God show Moses? Well, by at least the turn of the 3rd century BC, we know this from Jubilees, from First Enoch, from the Qumran materials. It was pretty much the agreed consensus that what God showed Moses was a heavenly original, if you will, the temple in heaven, the heavenly liturgy. And that's what was to be duplicated on earth. So that all is on earth as it is in heaven. Familiar phrase, by the way. So the temple liturgy, with the exception of Yom Kippur and the offering of blood, which was peculiar to the fallen state, as we would say, the worship of the temple was the worship of heaven. Inside the temple, not the sacrifice outside. And who got to see inside the temple but priests, who were hereditary? You couldn't volunteer. In a way, that's what comes out, as it were, out of the closed circle with the people of the Messiah, because all are priests in that special sense of being able to see and participate in the worship of heaven. That would take me down another path, and I'm not going to go there because I've just about run out of time. So the solution to my conundrum was the following. The hierarchies are intended to reveal, first, the proper shape of the soul, and to form that shape. He says as much. The hierarchy, meaning liturgy, stamps its celebrants. And a seal impresses itself on them, shapes them. And this was a fully traditional notion by the time the Areopagite was written, as I later found out through my acquaintance with Syriac materials. You find the outline of what I've sketched in Ephraim Syros, in his wonderful Paradise hymns. Pointed out by the great introduction by Sebastian Brock to his translation for St. Vladimir's Press of those hymns. And a really illuminating little table that he has on page 45 that made me fall over. And then I was led to the Liber Gradium, to the Macarian homilies, where this very idea is expressly stated. Because those are monks who are facing the question from other monks, why do we need all that ecclesiastical apparatus when we can pray and get the Holy Spirit? You need all that priestcraft. And these monks said, no, you do. A, it's revealed, but B, it also is essential for shaping the soul. So this was given to me by my acquaintance and through my acquaintance with Emilianos of Simonos Petros, who became thus for me not simply the type of the saint, but proof of the presence of Christ, and as I said earlier, of the resurrection. And the answer to my question, we won't get into all those other questions that I laid out. I because my time is now up. In fact, it's just past time. So I managed winging it for half an hour. Proof of the resurrection, proof of the truth of the faith, the solution to my crise de foi. And there I'll conclude.